The house was perfect. It had been a grueling few months of searching, driving through neighborhoods that promised peace and security, only to be disappointed by peeling paint, cracked driveways, or astronomical prices. When I first saw the listing, it felt like divine intervention. 2 stories, a spacious backyard, and a wide front porch perfect for summer evenings with a book. The pictures gleamed with natural light, each room impeccably staged. Better yet, it was in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, a mere 30-minute commute to my new job. The asking price? Unbelievable. I'll take it, I told the real estate agent, Deborah, without even viewing it in person. I'll sign everything today. Deborah hesitated. You don't want to at least walk through it first? The house has, well, an unusual history. That should have been my first clue. But desperation overruled caution. I don't care about the history, I replied, laughing nervously. Doesn't every house have some skeletons in its closet? She smiled faintly, handing over the papers. Just know that once the deal is done, there are no takebacks. I didn't ask her to elaborate. Moving day was a whirlwind. I hired a van, piled it high with my mismatched furniture, boxes of books, and too many kitchen gadgets for one person, and arrived at the house just as the afternoon sun dipped low. It was even more stunning in person. The white siding gleamed against the golden light, and the yard was immaculately trimmed. I stood on the porch, key in hand, savoring the moment. The neighborhood was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. It was everything I'd dreamed of. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender, as if it had been cleaned only hours ago. The hardwood floors shone, and the walls were painted a neutral beige, boring, but easy to personalize. I walked from room to room, marveling at how effortlessly my life would fit into this space. It wasn't until I stepped outside to retrieve another box that I noticed the elderly woman standing across the street. She was motionless, her hands clutching a faded cardigan at her chest. Her face was shadowed, but I could feel her eyes locked on me. I offered a polite wave, but she didn't respond. "Can I help you?" I called out. She turned abruptly and shuffled back into her house. The first night in the house was uneventful. I fell asleep on a bare mattress in the master bedroom, lulled by the silence of the neighborhood. By the time morning arrived, I had almost forgotten the woman's strange behavior. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I unpacked during the evenings after work, filled the fridge with groceries, and took short walks around the cul-de-sac. That's when I began to notice something odd. Whenever I passed the other houses, curtains twitched. Neighbors turned away hurriedly if we made eye contact. It was as if my presence offended them. I thought about introducing myself, but something about their expressions, tight-lipped and wary, made me hesitate. Finally, after a week of this, I decided enough was enough. I saw a man mowing his lawn and waved him down. He slowed his machine and stared at me, his eyes flicking briefly to my house. "Hi, I'm Emily," I said brightly. "Just moved into number 12. Figured it's time to get to know the neighbors." The man's mouth opened and closed twice before he managed to speak. "You moved in?" "Yes." "To that house?" My cheerful demeanor faltered. "Yeah." "Why?" His face paled, and he glanced over his shoulder as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of joke this is, but you might want to stop." "What joke?" He gestured to the space behind me, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There's no house at number 12. I turned, my stomach twisting. The house stood as pristine as ever, bathed in the afternoon sunlight. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm living there. I bought it." The man took a step back, his mower forgotten. "You don't belong here. None of us go near that lot. Whatever you think you see, it's not real. Leave while you can." That night, I locked every door and window. I told myself the man was crazy, that his reaction was a bizarre suburban hazing ritual. But his words lingered, threading unease through the stillness of my home. As I lay in bed, I swore I could hear faint voices outside, whispers just beyond the edge of comprehension. At midnight, something tapped against my window. I froze under the covers, my breath shallow. The tapping came again, rhythmic and deliberate, like knuckles against glass. The bedroom window was just a few feet away, covered only by thin curtains that allowed the faint glow of the streetlight to filter in. From where I lay, I could see the fabric shift slightly with each tap. Probably a tree branch, I whispered to myself. But I knew better. There weren't any trees close enough to the house. Summoning what little courage I had, I crept out of bed, the hardwood floor cold beneath my feet. My pulse thundered in my ears as I inched toward the window. Tap. Tap. My fingers trembled as I pulled the curtain aside. The street outside was empty, bathed in a pale yellow glow. The neatly trimmed lawns and parked cars were undisturbed. No one was there. I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me. It must have been my imagination. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint outline on the glass, barely visible against the dim light. For elongated fingerprints trailed down the pane, as if someone had pressed their hand against it and dragged it slowly downward. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. There was no one outside, there couldn't have been. But those prints, they were fresh. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, the lights blazing. The next morning, I called Deborah. "Hey, quick question," I began, trying to sound casual. "Is there any weird history about this place? You mentioned something during the sale." There was a long pause. "Why do you ask?" "I'm just curious. The neighbors seem to think my house doesn't exist. One guy actually said it's not real." I laughed, though it came out forced. "Isn't that strange?" Another pause. "I'd rather not get into it over the phone," she said finally. "Can we meet in person?" "Sure." "When?" "How about this afternoon?" "My office, 3 p.m. The hours until our meeting dragged painfully. Every creak and groan of the house seemed louder than usual. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see another handprint. By the time I arrived at Deborah's office, my nerves were frayed. She greeted me with a tight smile and gestured for me to sit. "So," I began, leaning forward, "what's the deal with the house?" Deborah's fingers fidgeted with a pen. "There's a reason it was priced so low," she admitted. "Number 12 has a reputation in the area. Most people won't even walk by it, let alone live there." "Why not?" Her eyes darted to the window as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "The lot where your house stands, it was empty for decades. Some say it's cursed. Others claim it's haunted. About 5 years ago, a developer tried to build on it. That's when things started happening." "What things?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "The workers reported hearing voices, screaming, laughing, crying. Tools would go missing and show up in strange places. Blueprints were altered without explanation. They'd wake up to find their equipment scattered, as if someone, or something, had sabotaged them. Eventually, the project was abandoned. But the house is there now," I pointed out. She nodded reluctantly. 2 years ago, the property sold to a private owner. They finished construction and listed it. You're the first person who stayed longer than a week." That last sentence sent a chill through me. "What happened to the others?" "They all left," Deborah said simply. "Some claimed the house wasn't there when they returned from work. Others refused to explain. One family vanished entirely." I leaned back in my chair, my head spinning. "You should have told me this before I bought it." "You wouldn't have believed me," she said flatly. "And besides, you were determined. You said you didn't care about the history." I had no rebuttal. When I returned home, the unease that had been gnawing at me all week was now a full-blown panic. Deborah's story sounded absurd, but so did everything else that had happened since I'd moved in. That night, I made sure every light in the house was on. The bright glow made the shadows seem less threatening, but it didn't erase the growing sense of dread. Around midnight, the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. My phone's flashlight barely cut through it, illuminating only a few feet ahead. I stumbled through the house, trying to find the breaker box in the basement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the stairs. And then, from somewhere above me, I heard it, a soft, deliberate creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. No response. I shone the flashlight upward, but the beam didn't reach far enough to reveal anything. My rational mind insisted it was nothing, a draft, an old house settling. But deep down, I knew better. The creaking came again, louder this time. Closer. I bolted back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. As I pressed my back against it, gasping for breath, I felt something cold brush against my cheek. Turning slowly, I raised the flashlight. For long, pale fingerprints were streaked across the wall, glistening faintly in the dim light. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the living room couch, a kitchen knife clutched tightly in one hand, my phone in the other. I debated calling the police, but what could I say? I heard creaking and saw handprints. It wasn't a crime, and I couldn't prove anything. The power flickered back on just before dawn. I jumped at the sudden brightness, every bulb in the house blaring to life. The handprints were gone. By the time the sun rose, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined them, stress-induced paranoia. Still, I resolved to stay somewhere else that night. A hotel. Anywhere but here. I had just begun packing a bag when there was a knock at the door. The man standing on my porch was tall, his face weathered and tired. He wore a rumpled plaid shirt and jeans, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. "Can I help you?" I asked, wary. "You're living here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied cautiously. He sighed, glancing over his shoulder. "You need to leave. Now. Before it's too late." I felt a flash of irritation. If this is about the house doesn't exist thing, I'm not interested in hearing it again. The man shook his head. "It's not that simple." He hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I used to live here. My name's Richard. My family and I moved in 2 years ago." That caught my attention. "You lived here? What happened?" Richard's jaw tightened. "It started small, strange noises, objects moving. We thought it was just the house settling. Then my daughter started seeing things. She'd wake up screaming, saying there was someone in her room. I felt a chill creep down my spine." "Go on." "One night, she ran into our room, terrified. Said she saw a man standing in the hallway, staring at her. But when we checked, there was no one there." He swallowed hard. "After that, things escalated. We'd hear footsteps when no one was home, find doors open that we knew we'd locked. Then there were the shadows." "Shadows?" "Dark shapes, moving where they shouldn't. Sometimes they'd follow us." His voice cracked. "The last night we spent here, we heard banging on the walls, so loud it felt like the house was coming apart. We grabbed what we could and ran. We never came back." I stared at him, my stomach churning. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't want what happened to us to happen to you," he said earnestly. "This house, it isn't just haunted. It's wrong. Like it doesn't belong here. Like it's out of place." "That's ridiculous," I said, though my voice wavered. Richard gave me a sad look. "You'll see for yourself. If you stay, it'll take something from you. It always does." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, shaken. I should have left then. Packed my things, checked into a hotel, and never looked back. But something kept me there, a stubborn refusal to be scared away, a need to prove to myself that Richard was wrong. That evening, I returned to the bedroom to retrieve my phone charger. As I stepped inside, I stopped cold. The bed was pushed into the center of the room. I hadn't moved it. The air felt heavy, pressing against my skin. The faint scent of lavender, once soothing, now made my stomach turn. I approached the bed cautiously, half expecting it to lurch toward me. When nothing happened, I checked the corners of the room, looking for an explanation. That's when I saw it. The closet door was open, just a crack. I didn't remember leaving it that way. Swallowing my fear, I gripped the handle and yanked it open. The closet was empty, just as I'd left it. But on the inside of the door, scrawled in what looked like ash, were 3 words. "Get out now." I stumbled back, my heart racing. I ran to the living room, grabbed my bag, and made a beeline for the front door. But as I reached for the doorknob, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged in the air, and the lights flickered. The door refused to budge, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. I turned to the windows, but the curtains swayed unnaturally, as though buffeted by an unseen wind. The house felt alive, breathing, watching. And then I heard it, a deep, guttural voice, resonating from everywhere and nowhere. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice echoed through the walls, vibrating in my chest. I screamed, clutching at the doorknob with all my strength. Suddenly, it gave way, and I stumbled outside into the cold night air. The street was empty, silent, as if the neighborhood had been abandoned. But when I turned to look back at the house, my breath caught. It was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and littered with debris. I drove to a hotel, shaking, and spent the night staring at the ceiling. When morning came, I returned to the cul-de-sac, half convinced I'd imagined everything. But the house wasn't there. Instead, a sign stood in the center of the lot, its letters faded and weathered. "For sale. Lot 12. I sat in my car, staring at the empty lot as disbelief warred with a growing, cold certainty. The house, my house, had vanished as if it had never existed. There was no evidence that I had ever been there, no tire marks in the dirt, no traces of the lavender-scented interior, no sign of the life I'd begun building. But I still had the deed. My bag sat beside me on the passenger seat, packed hastily the night before. Somewhere inside, folded and stuffed in a pocket, were the signed papers, the key Deborah had given me, and receipts from the movers. Evidence that it hadn't all been in my head. I stepped out of the car and walked to the center of the lot. The weeds crunched underfoot, brittle and dry. The lot didn't feel normal. The air here was heavier, muted. The noises of the neighborhood, birds chirping, distant car engines, seemed to fade as I stepped onto the barren patch of land. The sensation of being watched crept over me. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the surrounding houses. Most of the blinds were drawn, but behind one window, a pale face ducked out of view. My heart raced as I approached the nearest house. I knocked sharply on the door, the sound echoing through the empty street. An older man answered. His face was lined with age, his eyes wary. "Can I help you?" he asked cautiously. I'm looking for answers," I stammered. I was living at number 12. The house was right here, but now it's gone. "Do you know anything about it?" His expression darkened immediately. He stepped out onto the porch, glancing both ways down the street before hissing, "You shouldn't talk about that. Not here. Please," I begged. "I don't understand what's happening. The house was real, I lived in it." The man shook his head. "No one's lived on that lot for years. It's cursed, miss. If you're smart, you'll leave and never come back." "Cursed?" I pressed. "What kind of curse? Why is this happening?" He glanced around again, his unease palpable. "It's not just the house," he whispered. "It's the land. There's something wrong with it. Always has been. People have tried to build there before, but it never lasts. Things show up. And then they disappear." "Things like what?" I asked, my voice rising. But he shook his head again and retreated into his home, locking the door firmly behind him. I spent the rest of the day driving aimlessly, trying to make sense of what had happened. My phone calls to Deborah went straight to voicemail, and the real estate office was locked when I stopped by. It was as if everyone connected to the house had vanished along with it. By evening, I found myself parked outside a library, poring over old property records and newspaper archives. The deeper I dug, the worse the story became. Lot 12 had a long and twisted history. Before the neighborhood existed, the land had belonged to a small settlement in the late 1800s. According to an old newspaper clipping, a fire had destroyed the settlement, leaving only ash and whispers of the unspeakable rituals practiced by the residents. The lot remained untouched for decades. Every attempt to build on it ended in failure, with workers reporting strange sightings and accidents. A photograph from 1956 showed a single structure, a ramshackle house with boarded windows, standing where my home had been. A caption beneath it read, "The vanishing house, appears without warning, disappears just as mysteriously." I felt sick. Every article pointed to the same conclusion: the lot was a place where reality fractured, where things appeared when they shouldn't exist, and vanished just as quickly. And I had lived there. As I sat in the dim library, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello?" A familiar voice came through, weak and distant. "Emily." "Deborah?" I gasped. "Where have you been? What's going on?" Her voice cracked, as though she were struggling to speak. "I'm sorry, I didn't tell you everything. I thought it would be okay this time." "Tell me what?" "The house." Her voice faded into static before returning. "Hunts. It looks for people. Lonely people. People who won't be missed. And when it's done with them, it..." The line went dead. "Deborah? Deborah!" I shouted, but the phone was silent. My hands trembled as I set the phone down. The house had been hunting me. And now, even though it was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't finished. The drive back to the hotel was a blur. Deborah's cryptic warning replayed in my head, her words echoing with every pulse of my fear. The house hunts, when it's done with them. What did it mean? Was I done? Had I escaped, or was this only the beginning? I reached my hotel room and double-locked the door, dragging a chair in front of it for good measure. The sterile beige walls and faint smell of bleach offered a semblance of normalcy, but I couldn't relax. My nerves were raw, my senses hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, I scrolled aimlessly through my phone, looking for more information about the house, the lot, anything that might explain what was happening. Most of the stories I found were vague, local legends, hearsay, and unsubstantiated rumors. But one story stood out. It was buried deep in an obscure paranormal forum. A user had written about staying in a house that sounded eerily similar to mine. They described the strange disappearances, the shifting walls, the whispers at night. But the post ended abruptly, as if the writer had abandoned their account mid-sentence. The final words sent a chill down my spine. Once you've lived there, it doesn't let you go. You carry it with you. You'll see it again, even when you think you've escaped. I spent the next few days bouncing between hotels, unwilling to stay in one place too long. Each night was worse than the last. I started seeing things, fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision, objects in my hotel rooms shifting inexplicably. The scent of lavender began to follow me, faint but unmistakable. And then, the dreams began. In the dreams, I was back in the house. The walls pulsed like they were alive, and the floors creaked with every step I took. I could never find the front door, no matter how many times I turned corners or opened doors. The whispers were louder here, forming words I couldn't quite understand. One night, I woke drenched in sweat, my throat raw from screaming. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I flinched at the sudden noise. It was a message. The sender's name was blank, and the text simply read, Come home. I drove back to the cul-de-sac the next morning, unable to resist the pull any longer. The lot was still empty, the weeds swaying gently in the breeze. But as I stood there, staring at the barren patch of land, I felt it again, that oppressive weight, the undeniable sense of being watched. And then I saw it. The house was back. It stood exactly as I remembered it, its white siding gleaming in the sunlight. The porch swing creaked softly in the wind, as if beckoning me closer. I wanted to run, to leave and never look back. But my legs betrayed me, carrying me toward the house as though I were in a trance. The front door swung open on its own, revealing the dim interior. The scent of lavender wafted out, stronger now, almost choking. I stepped inside. The house was exactly as I'd left it, my furniture, my belongings, all perfectly arranged. It was as if I'd never left. But the air felt different this time, heavier and colder. The whispers began almost immediately, louder than they'd ever been. They seemed to emanate from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. "Why are you here?" I whispered aloud, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony. And then, as if in answer, the walls began to ripple. The house was changing, its familiar layout shifting before my eyes. The living room stretched unnaturally, its walls bending inward like the maw of a great beast. The furniture dissolved into shadow, and the floors began to sag beneath my feet. Panicking, I turned toward the door, but it was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly, the light dimming with every step I took. "Let me go!" I screamed. A deep, guttural voice answered, reverberating through the walls. "You belong here." I don't know how long I wandered through the shifting labyrinth of the house. Time had no meaning here. The walls pulsed with a life of their own, and the whispers became screams, drowning out my thoughts. Finally, I stumbled into a room I didn't recognize. In its center stood a figure, a shadowy outline that seemed to absorb the light around it. "You were chosen," it said, its voice deep and hollow. "The house called to you because you fit. You've always belonged here." "No," I gasped. "I don't belong. I didn't ask for this." "You came willingly," it replied. "And now you can never leave." The next thing I remember is waking up in the middle of the empty lot, my clothes soaked with dew. The sun was rising, and the house was gone again. But something had changed. I could still feel it, a presence, lurking just beneath the surface of my mind. The house hadn't let me go. It had simply let me out for a while. I don't know how much longer I can fight it. Every day, the urge to return grows stronger. I'm not sure if I'll be able to resist the next time it calls. I didn't sleep for days after waking in the lot. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house. Its walls pulsed like a living thing, and its shadowy figure stood in the center, waiting. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. I told myself that stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on my mind, that the house was gone and could no longer hurt me. But the signs were impossible to ignore. The shadows that moved when they shouldn't. The faint scent of lavender that followed me everywhere. And the whispers. They started faint, barely audible, but grew louder with each passing day. "Come back. You belong. We're waiting." It wasn't just in my head. The whispers were real. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I drove to a motel in a town 2 hours away. I thought putting distance between myself and the lot might help, but the house followed me. I woke in the middle of the night to find the motel room warped, the walls bending inward as the scent of lavender filled the air. For a moment, I thought I'd fallen asleep and dreamt my escape, that I'd never truly left the house. When I bolted outside, gasping for fresh air, the motel's parking lot felt alien, the world unreal. I had to find Deborah. She was the only one who might have answers. The real estate office was abandoned. Its windows were boarded up, and a "For Lease" sign hung crookedly in the front. The phone number on the sign was disconnected when I tried to call. No one in the surrounding businesses knew where Deborah had gone. "You mean the lady who worked there?" a barista from the coffee shop next door asked. "She left months ago. I think she moved out of state." Deborah was gone, just like the house. I was alone. I thought of Richard and his family, of how they had fled in the middle of the night. He'd warned me, told me the house would take something from me. Was this what he meant? That it would haunt me no matter where I went? I spent hours on the phone with paranormal experts, historians, even a priest. Their advice was contradictory and useless. Cleanse yourself with sage. Burn the deed and sever your connection. You need an exorcist. I tried all of it. Nothing worked. The house wasn't just haunting me. It was a part of me. Weeks passed, and my life unraveled. I lost my job after showing up late too many times, my excuses growing more erratic with each absence. Friends stopped answering my calls, weary of hearing about the house and my growing paranoia. Everywhere I went, the house was there. I'd catch glimpses of it in reflections, hovering just behind me. Its silhouette appeared in my peripheral vision, a fleeting shape that vanished when I turned to face it. And the whispers were relentless. "Come back. Come home. You belong." I tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. One night, I found myself driving back to the cul-de-sac, as if compelled by an invisible force. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. The neighborhood was dark and quiet when I arrived, the streetlights flickering weakly. I parked at the edge of the lot, unable to bring myself to step out of the car. But the house was there again. It stood as pristine as ever, its windows glowing faintly. The porch swing creaked, though there was no wind. The whispers grew louder as I stared at it. "Come back. Come home." Tears streamed down my face as I fought the overwhelming urge to go inside. I gripped the car door, torn between escape and surrender. Finally, I couldn't resist any longer. The door opened before I reached it. The scent of lavender washed over me, stronger than ever, making my head spin. The whispers surrounded me, pulling me inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The house had been waiting for me. This time, there was no pretense of normalcy. The walls pulsed, their surface rippling like flesh. The floor buckled beneath my feet, and the shadows moved with purpose, circling me. The deep, guttural voice from before resonated through the house. "You belong here. You always have." I tried to run, but the house wouldn't let me. The door slammed shut behind me, and the floor gave way, pulling me into darkness. When I woke, I was back in the living room. But something was different. The house was alive, its walls breathing, its shadows moving freely. The whispers were gone, replaced by a low hum that seemed to come from the house itself. I tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. The windows showed only darkness beyond, as if the house were no longer in the real world. And then I saw it. My reflection in the window wasn't my own. It was the shadowy figure I'd seen before, the one that had spoken to me. Its hollow eyes stared back at me, filled with a terrible understanding. I realized then what Richard had meant. The house didn't just take people. It absorbed them. I wasn't its prisoner. I was a part of it now. The house is still there, waiting for the next person to find it. It will appear again, shiny and perfect, a dream home for someone lonely and desperate. And I will be there too, watching from the shadows, waiting for the house to choose its next victim.